Good afternoon, folks. Thanks so much for being here. My name's Eliza. I'm on staff here at the Oregon Historical Society. And we are really honored here today to have an incredible panel, among whom is David Harrelson, who is a member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, whose homelands we're on here in Portland. So I'm going to turn it over to David to welcome us to this space.
Hello, everyone. Good to be here today. I thought that in honor of this being to inspire music, I thought I'd sing a welcome song. So instead of talking, since you'll hear me talk, I figure I'll sing a traditional song and then I'll tell you a little bit about it. Thank you. I do think we have a couple seats up front. If there's any seats next to you, maybe raise your hand. We've got one up here, a couple over there, just to be able to have some people from the back move forward. Keep your hand up if you have a seat next to you so people can come find seats. While I tell you about this song. So that song is called Traveling with Our Ancestors. And I sang it because when we've talked about what downtown Portland is to our ancestral people, it's a traveling place. And it's a traveling place because our villages were up at Willamette Falls, upstream of here near Oregon City, and down near the mouth of the river, with one village being where St. John's is today. And so when we think about downtown Portland, the place where our ancestors would be gathering in these places, or hunting, or traveling in their canoes up and down the river. And so I wanted to sing that song for you today. And with that, I will turn it back over to Eliza.
When I hear David sing in this room, I feel like he built it for that, because it sounds amazing, so thank you. Thanks all for joining us here at the Oregon Historical Society. Our mission here is to preserve our state's history and make it accessible to everyone in ways that advance knowledge and inspire curiosity about all the people, places, and events that have shaped Oregon. And one of the ways that we're able to accomplish this work, sometimes the very best, is through partnerships with other people and organizations. And Portland Jazz Composers Ensemble, who we've worked with along with Montevilla Jazz, who's a new partner for us on this program. But PJCE has been working for many years to draw on the stories, the history stories of our state, and to bring them to more audiences in new ways through music. And we just really, here at OHS, admire the work that PJCE does and are excited to see all of the music that the composers are going to write about Mount Tabor. And I think, having music about history gives us an opportunity to really connect with the ways that history can be emotional. And that's really exciting. So thank you very much to our partners. And I know that there are a lot of funders who make that work possible, including RAC, the Regional Arts and Culture Council, who's here. So thanks, RAC. We appreciate your being here as well. And I'm sure that our partners, the folks from PJCE and Montevilla Jazz, will speak a little bit later in the program, and we'll give you more information about that. But I do want to let you know here at the Historical Society, we're supported by a broad range of folks, volunteers, members, corporate donors, private funders, foundations, and also public funds. Here in Multnomah County, people have voted now 3 times to provide a modest property tax levy that supports OHS and 4 historical societies in East Multnomah County. So if you live in Multnomah County, your admission here is prepaid. You come to the museum for free anytime, and thank you very much for that support. We really appreciate it. If you're not already a member of OHS and are interested in joining today, it's the perfect time to do it because when you join as a member, you get 20% off everything in the museum store. So definitely think about that. There's some beautiful things in there. It's the best gift shop in town, I'm telling you. We have a research library that's free and available to everyone. Come in Tuesday through Saturday and research to your heart's desire about any aspect of regional history. You can find something here. We have museum exhibits here and traveling exhibits that go out around the state. We have online resources, the Oregon Encyclopedia, the Time Web, digital collections online, a museum portal to museum objects. We have a journal, the Oregon Historical Quarterly, now in its 124th year, and subscription to that is a benefit of membership with OHS. And you can also purchase back issues in the museum store. We also do a lot of work with K-12 education, and I'm sure there are things I'm forgetting. But if you're not already familiar with OHS, please do get to know us. Let me just make sure you're oriented a little bit in the space today. You came in on the 2nd floor. We are right now in the process of building a brand new bathroom that's going to be super accessible from this room, but it's not finished yet. So in the meantime, my recommendation, if you want to use the restroom, is to go to the 1st floor. And the best way to get there is just over here to my left, the elevator or the stairs. Go down, look for the water fountain. That's the hallway where the bathrooms are, and there are large restrooms down there for folks to use, and that's where the water fountain is too. Please make yourselves comfortable. So I'm going to introduce our 4 panelists. They're each going to speak individually. Then our partners are going to come up and tell you a little bit about the project that they're informing today by their talks. And we're going to have a facilitated Q&A, so there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions as well. So I'll introduce them in the order that they're going to speak. So first will be Pritchard, who moved here with his wife Bonnie to the Portland area in 2004 to be close to their 2 children and their grandchildren. This move coincided with Hap's retirement from an 18-year career at the EPA and a 3-year program at the Danish National Environmental Research Laboratory. At the EPA, Hap participated and led programs in environmental biotechnology and risk assessment, the most renowned of which was the use of bioremediation in the cleanup of the Exxon Valdez oil spill. Retirement has allowed him to stay very busy. He teaches microbiology at Portland State University and chemistry at the Oregon Episcopal School. He also dabbles in his woodworking shop and his model train room. And in 2019, he joined the Friends of Mount Tabor board and took on the responsibility of managing the visitor center at Mount Tabor Park. Next speaking will be David Harrelson, who you heard from a little bit already. He's the Cultural Resources Department Manager for the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, where he's also a tribal member. He is active in his community and currently serves on the as an Oregon Arts Commissioner. He's worked for over 10 years in the field of cultural resources, and he has championed the protection of archaeology sites, maintenance of ancestral lifeways, and proliferation of indigenous art forms throughout his tribe's homelands here in Western Oregon. Dr. Marie Rose Wong is a professor emerita with the Institute of Public Service at Seattle University. Her research investigates urban planning and policy, housing, and land use with a focus on Asian American settlements. Her presentations and publications center on Asian American history and urban development, and they include several articles, as well as a very well-known, loved, and much-used book on Portland, Oregon's Chinese communities entitled Sweet Cake's Long Journey, The Chinatowns of Portland, Oregon, published twice. It's going into second publication in 2012. She's also published on the history of Seattle's Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino settlements in building tradition, Pan-Asian Seattle, and life in the residential hotels. She's currently working on book projects that chronicle the histories of Seattle's Japanese-American community baseball and Seattle's Lucknow Chinese Music Club. And then finally, Dr. Darrell Millner holds a bachelor's in English from California State Polytechnic University and a DED in English Curriculum and Instruction from the University of Oregon. He began teaching in the Black Studies Department at Portland State University in 1975, and he served as department chair from 1984 to 1995. He is currently Professor Emeritus and continues to teach as an adjunct faculty member in the department. He is an expert on the history of African Americans in the Western movement with a special focus on the Oregon and California Trail experiences, Early Oregon and California Black History, and the history of the Black Buffalo Soldiers in the Indian Wars. He served as guest co-editor of the Oregon Historical Quarterly's Winter 2019 special issue on white supremacy and resistance, and he is perhaps best known to his students as the biggest Los Angeles Lakers fan in Portland. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me back there? Okay, good. I'm trying to keep this microphone up my nose so you can't hear me. But don't hesitate to raise your hand if you can in the back of the room. I'm very honored to be here today, and I'm not sure my background is exactly in line with somebody else's, but having spent a lot of time at Mount Tabor Park, I think I might have a few things to add to your life that might be of interest. So to get started, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the park itself. For those of you who may not know some of the historical details, one of the things to consider is that Mount Tabor is like a bump. Mount Tabor is like a bump in the horizon. There's an area basically called the Portland Basin. It's relatively flat. It was at one time loaded with marsh areas and streams and rivers to some extent. And because of that, the Earth's crust was full of cracks and faults. And as a result, magma would push things up. And so Mount Tabor is an example of just how magma pushed up from underneath and created a bump in the horizon. You can see from the slide.
Please hold the microphone up.
All right, got it. I thought I'd have to eat this before I was done. But you can see in the background, there's actually a bunch of these bumps. Powell Butte, Kelly Butte, you're probably all familiar with that. And as I'll point out later on, Mount Tabor is unique in the sense that it actually went through a volcanic eruption. All right. The other thing to comment on is that Mount Tabor really got some of its recognition back in the late 1800s because of the problems Portland had with drinking water. And in those days, it was really a mess because you had to take water from local streams and from the river. A lot of pollution occurred. And of course, you had to use steam engines to pump the water. So in looking around for an alternative source, we went to what's known as Bull Run Lake. Many of you are probably familiar with that as a source of water. And it came directly to Mount Tabor. And when you look at Mount Tabor right here, you can see that probably people in Portland said, hey, look at that bump there. It's got a beautiful basin. We could just put a dam there and fill it with water. And sure enough, that's what created, that's what created, anyway, the oval reservoir right there is Reservoir 5, and that corresponds with the place you see up. Anyway, okay. So the town fathers realized that this would be an ideal spot in which you could pump water or let water flow into Mount Tabor and then distribute that water throughout the Portland area by gravity. And so what makes both Mount Tabor and Portland's water system so unique is that it's entirely gravity fed, and some of the best water in the United States for sure. And so today we have 3 reservoirs, unfortunately not all full, because they've had some leakage problems. But you can see the 3 that are here. Years ago, back in 1952, there was actually an additional reservoir running along Division Street, which is no longer in operation. It's now an old folks' home. But so these things, and of course now you realize that Mount Tabor is no longer the source of our drinking water. The reservoirs are there for our desire and appeal. So all the water that comes from Bull Run goes right by Mount Tabor now to Powell Butte. Okay. Okay, so I just want to talk about Mount Tabor as an urban oasis. And the more I look into other cities and their parks, the more I realize that Mount Tabor is really exceptionally unique. Okay, not only is it a beautiful park, but it's a mountain. And so the ability to get up from ground level to a height where you can begin to enjoy real freshness and real renewal on Mount Tabor Park offers that very definitely. These pictures you see here are part of a photo contest we had a year ago, which we invited people that use Mount Tabor Park to submit their photographs, and this is the result. And what I have here for is to really tell you about the sereneness that occurs in Mount Tabor. It's really a place to come, lose yourself in thinking about things that aren't important, but also important to you, to rekindle, to reawake a lot of the aspects that you have. So you don't just visit Mount Tabor Park, you actually participate. You actually get involved in it, which I think is one of the unique things. And I've been involved at the visitor center, and we have visitors who come all the time, and they express the idea that, I just came here to visit, but I've gotten much more out of it than just seeing it. I'm really sort of interacting with it in that respect. And so that it also brings us to the idea of the value of awe, which I think is so important in everyday life, is where you can actually come to a place and say, oh my, that is so fantastic. And so with the Doug fir trees we have there, with the very beautiful big leaf maple trees we have, and the red cedars, it's a place where you can come and just take a deep breath and enjoy every minute of it. It's an awesome place in that respect. The other thing that's so important about Mount Tabor, and if you check other parks in various cities, the accessibility of Mount Tabor is one of the most important and gratifying aspects of that park. There's actually 2 bus routes that will drop you right off at the park, but people walk to the park all the time from really quite surprising distances. And what we know is that Mount Tabor Park is a destination, not just for Portlandites, but it's anybody that comes to Portland. One of the first things they want to do is, you got to go to Mount Tabor, see what it's like. So that's important. And then finally, as I think many of you are aware, this idea of associating with green areas, green spaces in an urban community is super important for your health. All right? Not so much the activity of exercising in a park, but just being absorbed into the beauty of green space does a lot for making you feel better, creating less sickness, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not just a feeling that I have. It's actually a scientifically based idea. And more information is coming out of that stuff. Okay. So I want to also emphasize that one of the aspects of living in a city like Portland is you want to be able to go to a place where you can actually say, hey, maybe this is a little bit like the wildness that I had thought about in the past. And so this idea of urban ecology, can you go to a place within an urban area and actually experience some ecological relationships? How do organisms and trees and plants and people interact together to create an interesting atmosphere? And so there's a lot of things that can go on at Mount Tabor Park that you can see. One of the more interesting ones is up in the corner there is goldfinches. And just relatively recently, they stopped spraying to get rid of dandelions at the park. Goldfinches love dandelions. And so now, as a result of the bloom of dandelions, there's also been a huge bloom of goldfinches. So one of the beauties is you can go to a park like this and actually see goldfinches doing their life story. It's sort of fun. So we have a pretty significant bird migration season. The birds actually focus in on Mount Tabor Park, at least theologically I think they are. But anyway, it's a great place to watch the spring migrants as they come through. And one of the main reasons is that the migration coincides almost exactly with the increase in the numbers of caterpillars that are found in the vegetation at Mount Tabor. So the birds are coming in to feed on the caterpillars. So in April, May, and June, if you're going through the park, keep your eye out on the trees for the birds that are moving through as part of that migration. Mount Tabor is one of the hot spots to go to in that spring activity. There's also an interesting thing we have this parasitic activity going on that a lot of people don't know about, and that's the beauty of mistletoe. I think of mistletoe as being so romantic, associated with the holidays, but mistletoe is actually a parasite. And so it's growing. And in Mount Tabor is one of the best examples of mistletoe parasitism I've ever seen. So that figure in the middle of the tree, that big clump in the top, that's actually one of the biggest collections of mistletoe I've ever seen. And I think eventually that tree is not going to make it. The heaviness of that mistletoe now is putting a lot of stress on that tree. So you might want to get out there early and see it. It's right near the visitor center. So these kinds of urban ecological aspects are, to me, one of the beauties of Mount Tabor Park. Okay, Mount Tabor is also renowned for its connection to histories. I mentioned the idea that Mount Tabor was formed as a result of magma pushing up. Well, of course, what's also occurred is that at Mount Tabor, that magma actually blew out to the side. So if you go to the visitor center, you're able to see the caldera. There it is. You see that? Okay. That's the leftover caldera from the volcano that erupted about 200,000 years ago. It looks like it's going to be pretty dead for some time to come, so don't worry about that. And unfortunately, in the old days, they wanted to create space for the parking lot there, so a lot of the walls of the caldera were removed and to make rock walls. So when you're up there, the rock walls in the park are made out of lava. So it's a very interesting history from that standpoint. I mentioned the drinking water problem that Portland had and how it was solved by pumping or by allowing water from Bull Run to come through. And so in the early 1900s, the main source of our drinking water in Portland was Mount Tabor. And there's a very interesting history there. You realize back in the late 1800s that if you wanted to tap water from Bull Run, which is about 30 miles from here, you had to run a pipe. And so in those days, a guy by the name of Colonel Isaac Smith pioneered a trail from here to Bull Run, laid pipe to allow water to flow downhill from Bull Run to Mount Tabor. And I always think that if we had to put a sculpture or a statue back up in Mount Tabor, Colonel Isaac Smith would be a good example of something that's contributed to Mount Tabor. Also, I think Native Americans, although I haven't been able to track down exact details of it, but I think Mount Tabor was at one time, from a historical standpoint, traversed by lots of Native American people. I think a lot of the trails that they used are still, in fact, somewhat represented today with the trails that we have there. And it's even possible that they had orchards there where they grew produce. So it's very active. I think we'll hear a little bit more. One of the interesting histories is that Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed a law that specifically protected Bull Run watershed to give water to Portland. So we have that sort of as an important historical aspect. And then we'll hear a little bit later, I think, about the Chinese. And as many of you are aware, back in the early 1900s, the Ku Klux Klan was very active in Portland, and particularly at Mount Tabor, where they burned a few crosses. So as people coming through the visitor center asking, well, what's so great about Mount Tabor? Well, we say we've got the urban ecology, we've got the urban green space, but we also have a lot of interesting histories to go with that. And then I just want to make mention of the fact that what makes parks successful, at least in the Portland area, but also across the United States, is the activity of the volunteers. And so, being part of Friends of Mount Tabor Park, we have three major volunteer groups, what we call the Foot Patrol, what we call the Weed Warriors, and the Visitor Center. where we have over 100 different volunteers that give their time. And it's to their honor and tribute that they keep the park looking as appealing and as exciting to people as they are. We also have a lot of sponsored activities. These are things that go on in the park, things like foot races, soapbox derby. It's an ongoing thing. Concerts, in fact, the jazz thing will have their concert up there in September. So it's the volunteers that keep a park like Mount Tabor in good working order. Thanks. So
all right, can you hear me okay? Okay, real close, got it, real close. So, it's good to be with you all. I'm David Harrelson. My ancestors are Kalapuya, not Chinook from these homelands, but I have the honor of working for the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. And people from this area signed the same treaty that my great-grandfather signed for the Kalapuya and came to the Grand Ronde Indian Reservation. So when I was asked to talk a little bit about history of place, I said, yeah, let's do it. And then I said, Mount Tabor is real specific. So we're going to make it a little bit more broad. You heard the name Portland Basin earlier. So that's sort of the idea of what I'm going to talk about. We're going to talk a little bit about the people, some about worldview, and approaches to things. The picture that you're looking at is a picture from out on Sabi Island. It is a wapato patch. Wapato is a really important food in this area, traditional food, and it's a tuber that grows in marshy wetlands, and you can eat it. And this is an example where they blew a levee, and the whole dormant seedbed just popped right back into existence, which is really exciting, and a really beautiful picture of kind of resilience on the landscape. So, to give some context, I have to talk about worldview. And for our ancestors, time is not necessarily linear, meaning that it's not like chronological, the way that we think about things. And so the visual that you see in front of you has the word econom, which is a tribal word meaning like traditional or ancestral story, creation story. It's like the old times before people were on Earth. There's historic and there's modern. And a part of what you see here is there's a landscape. And when we talk about our history, we say that our history is written upon the landscape, right? And so it's best told when you're in the landscape. And the other aspect of this is that oftentimes I think in today's world, many people think that modern is somehow more important and has greater clarity. But from one of the cultural viewpoints that we have is that both historic and econom can actually have greater clarity of authenticity to place and understanding than what is even capable for us to comprehend today within the modern. So when we're in places and we're thinking and we're contextualizing and we're translating how the world's changed today and talking to our kids to ensure that it maintains generation after generation, we're doing all this work, right? We're talking about things that are before people were on Earth, when Coyote was about this landscape doing things. We're talking about the histories, which is often the smallest area of time, and then we're talking about modern. And modern can include now, but it can also include into the future. Why this becomes so interesting as relevant to Mount Tabor is that it means that places where you can get up and see stuff and talk about the landscape are universally important around the homelands of Western Oregon. And so places like Mount Angel in the Willamette Valley, places like Mary's Peak, places like Spirit Mountain, places like Malala Table Rock, places like, we'll talk about Mount Hood later, we'll talk about these mountains. Those are all really important places, not as much as their own significance and the histories that tie them, but the stories that can be told from those locations. That was a whole lot of ideas, so let me check my notes. Okay, so when we talk about my ancestors being in this place, we say that we've been here since time immemorial. What is time immemorial? Time immemorial is literally since a time that no one can remember. And in order to understand that, you have to understand all the stuff that we remember. So we're going to talk about that. The visual that you see, let me see if I can get my pointer. The yellow star, that's Mount Tabor. B is Portland. A, and this is a diagram that's a map that's showing sort of the flooded Portland Basin in the northern Willamette Valley. These are the Dundee Hills. This is the Yola-Amity Hills. This out here is where Willamette Falls is in Oregon City. And this is what this area of the world would look like as if you were on top of the Coast Range looking east at about 30,000 feet at a 3/4 angle down. And what it shows you is what this area would look like with 400 feet of water in it. And why that's applicable to share is because our ancestors have stories about that event. Our ancestors have been here at least that long. Over 500 generations, Indigenous people have been here in Western Oregon. And that event is known kind of collectively as the Missoula floods, or the Brett's floods. And it's guessed to be between 13 and 18,000 years ago. That's really hard when, we think that last year was a long time ago, or a pandemic ago, right? Which is a really long time ago. That might be disproportionately different. But I like to say 7 times Jesus, right? A lot of people know Jesus, 7 times Jesus, or 3 times pyramids of Egypt. And yes, we are actually closer to the time of Jesus than Jesus was to the creation of the pyramids. And I'm talking about 3 times older than the pyramids being constructed is when this geological event happened. It filled the Willamette Valley full of 400 feet of water, and Mount Tabor is 636 feet tall, which means it was out of the floodplain. And our ancestral stories actually talk about people running out from their villages and going up mountains and seeking refuge in those places and paddling in canoes back and forth until the floodwaters recede. That's specific to Mary's Peak, Mount Jefferson, Mount Angel. There's no specific stories about Mount Tabor, but I think it's interesting. So, we got to talk about the people of this place. So, Indigenous people of this area, once again, follow the yellow star. The yellow star is Mount Tabor. Yellow star is Mount Tabor. You actually have to find 2 maps to really talk about the cultural area in this volume that the Smithsonian put together called the Handbook on North American Indians. They split our people into 2 books, like the government split our people into multiple reservations. If there was one reservation for the Chinook people, it would probably be somewhere on the lower Columbia River. All these areas in dark are areas where culturally people called the Chinook came from. You have all the way, this is the mouth of the Columbia River out here. Astoria is here. Portland is here. The Dalles is up here. This is down here. This is Portland. So you're getting that orientation. There's lower Chinookan-speaking people, there's upper Chinookan-speaking people, and conveniently, many of our watersheds or our counties are named after them. So when I say names like Clackamas, or Multnomah, or Cathlamet, or Clatsop, Wasco, right? All of these names are probably familiar to you because they're ingrained in the way that we have naming conventions. But those are all the names of ancestral people that would have been Chinook. They spoke a language, common similar language, they had common similar lifeways, cultural exchange, and those are the people of this place. It doesn't mean that there aren't other people who came through, right? There's people who came through and visited, and in fact, Chinook were very known historically as powerful people that traded up and down the coast. Their canoes were famous. You want to take a look at a Chinook canoe, it's in the exhibit here, the Scoville canoe. I really encourage you to look at that. Our canoes, those canoes are found all the way from Baja to Alaska, right? And they're from this area of the world, Chinookan canoes. With all that trade, there's interaction with other people, like my ancestors, the Kalapuya to the south. Here's a picture. Paul Kane, famous artist, right? He came out here, he drew some pictures of people. Here's some of the drawings of Clackamas men. You know, the one man in the center actually has white face paint on the upper part of his face. That would have been for ceremony or dances. And the man on the left actually shows signs of something called cranial deformation, the flatheads, right? That's people of the lower Columbia River practice this when they're in cradles as children, and they actually flatten their head, with the goal being a straight line between your eyebrows and your hairline. So, cultural geography of the Portland Basin. This is a cool map. You totally want to spend more time with this map, not looking at it from really far away. I'll try to orient you. This is Lewis and Clark's map of the Portland Basin. So, it's confusing because you have the Columbia River here, and then you have this inset, which is the Willamette River, as if it came up. So on this map, this is the Willamette River. This is the inset of the Willamette River. To orient you, up here, this is where the airport is, which is known as, they record it as this, but the way that we talk about it today is the Nechockley Village. And if that village existed today, it would be under the runways at PDX International Airport. Down here would be the village that's adjacent to the Willamette River. This is like Government Island. I-205 is like coming through here. And then up here would be a village up on the Washington side of the river, potentially Cathal-Podal. If you've ever gone to Ridgefield National Wildlife Refuge, I'll have a picture of a plank house that you can see later. And then this is St. John's. This is actually the village that was at where St. John's is today, just up from Cathedral Park. This is where Mount Tabor is. So it's like resident village that would be closest is the Nechockley village that would be out by the airport, kind of on the Columbia. The Columbia Slough, which is now this big industrial place, hugely productive ecological place. You know, from waterfowl to fish habitat to everything else. A really big deal for gathering. The other part that I want to talk about is that our ancestors lived in the seasonal round. So our ancestors were neither sedentary nor nomadic. And one of those things that oftentimes gets really misunderstood is that our ancestors lived in these plank houses. We'll have another picture of it. This is actually an etching done by Agate, I believe in 1843, of one of the plank houses at the Nechockley Village where Portland International Airport is today. Right? This is what life looked like inside. So you have a multi-generational, multi-family housing. There are these bunks on the side. They're large gable roof structures, roughly up to 30 foot tall. They could be as long as 400 feet long. And there were dividers like mats that would hang in between. But individual families or people had their own private bunks, and there were central fire pits in the middle with fish drying racks above, our little dog friends. This guy, he's not angry, he's actually gambling. He's playing a game called Bones, or Stick Game, if you're familiar with that. This is what life looked like. There's some art design motifs that if you look in real detail, the artist didn't really seem to be that drilled in or interested about it, but they're there. You actually have a man with a headdress here, etched on the back big post beam. This gives you a little bit of an idea of life. Well, these were storehouses. So today, if you go to Ridgefield National Wildlife Refuge up in Ridgefield, Washington, where the Cathal-Podal village was ancestrally, you'll see a replica of a plank house. And this is an art form, as well as what you see over here from the inside house posts that reflects the art form of this place. There's actually an indigenous art form of this place. You don't have to go to Vancouver Island to get totem pole art, although that's really exceptional, right? Tlingit and other art, Tsimshian, Kwakwakwa art. We don't have totem pole art down here. We don't have form line. We have something called Chinookan art or Columbia River art, and this is a little bit of an example of that. So these houses were used for food storage. So people would go to all their different resource sites throughout the year, going to different gathering sites at different times of year when resources were ready. They would process them, and then they'd bring them back to their winter storehouses, these plank houses, where they would hang out all winter long, right? When it's cold, wet, miserable. You hang out in your house, you weave baskets, you tell stories, and have a good time. Not your Y East. I'm sorry, guys. I know it's been popularized. Y East, really, we've had people look into it. We're hoping for a forthcoming article in the quarterly. Dr. Henry Zank's been working on it. But the origin of Y East, the best likely source, really points back to a romantic pioneer storyteller. Kind of similar to that story at Multnomah Falls that you probably read about the Indian princess. Yeah, it's probably not an Indian story, right? If there's a moral to the lesson, or if there's like an Indian princess, like it's probably not a real Indian story. Neither is the name Y East. This is actually a view of Mount Hood from Mount Tabor. And I wanted to show it because it's so prominent and it's so significant. And the names of that place to the indigenous people on either side of the mountain are, the Clackamas name for the mountain is Wakakan. The Wasco name for the mountain is Akakan. You'll notice that's similar. Both of them speak Upper Chinookan, so they're just dialects of the same, even though they ended up at different Indian reservations. And then the Molalla name. Molalla people lived where kind of Molalla, Oregon is now, in the northeast part of the Willamette Valley. They have the name Nifty Yongit for the mountain. And so these are things that, there are so many things named Y East, it's like completely wild, and I had to use the opportunity to tell you all about these names. And if you're looking to name anything, like, let's use those. Please be in touch. And tribal people have been complicit in that too, very much so. It's become so popularized as a name that even tribal people like began repeating it, where that shows up in like 1920, 1930s, which has only made it further and further more confusing. But we feel like we've sleuthed it down pretty well to say that we can't find, looking anywhere, everywhere, a real indigenous origin to that name. So, treaties. There were treaties for Western Oregon. These are the Royce maps. Oh, let's go back. In the area in yellow, this is roughly the crest of the Cascades. The pink area is actually the Warm Springs Reservation. The area in yellow is a treaty called the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855. It's that treaty that my ancestors signed for the Santiam Kalapuya people. And it was also signed by the Clackamas, the Multnomah, the Clawley-Walla, the people at Willamette Falls, and include the groups that we talked about early, as well as the Kalapuya of the valley and the Molalla people of the valley. And that removed people to the Grand Ronde Indian Reservation. Grand Ronde exists as a place today. We're located about 35 miles outside of Portland towards the coast. If you're on the highway out to Lincoln City, you'll probably go by our casino, Spirit Mountain Casino, which is how people mostly know us. And yes, there's a real Spirit Mountain. It's the mountain that's there, and it's actually a sacred site, and has been for a long time. It wasn't just the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855. There were 6 other treaties in Western Oregon that were signed, all with different tribal peoples. And of those 7 treaties, 30 different tribes and bands came to the Grand Ronde Indian Reservation. So you hear me talk about representing the tribe, but on our reservation itself, it's a confederation of many people. And the only reason why it's called Grand Ronde is because it was a large round valley, and there were French speakers in the valley, the pioneers, and they called it that, and that's what it would have ended up. The actual Kalapuya name for the valley is called Chichalu, and it means the place of the burnt timber. And if we were named after ourselves, we would be the Chichalu Reservation. But that's not what we are. We're the Grand Ronde Reservation, and we're a tribe named after the reservation. This is a picture of us in one of those canoes that I talked about. We're actually dedicating this sculpture that's in the middle, the man from Kashik, which is a traditional story about how we learned how to eel as a people. And we delivered that sculpture to George Rogers Park in Lake Oswego, to the waterfront, a number of years ago. And it's a beautiful picture of the canoes out on the water, so I wanted to share that. There's some other sources. If you're really interested about this history, check out the Chinookan peoples of the Lower Columbia. Check out Oregon and the Collapse of the Illahee by Gray Whaley. If you're interested in botanical information, I strongly recommend Pacific Northwest Foraging by Doug Dewar. Part of what's unique about that book, instead of foraging as free food, is they actually take the time to share information that's from tribal informants that talks about how you sustainably harvest something and interact with the environment. And then there's a great article that was actually published in OHQ, but you can get direct access to it by searching Chinookan villages of the Lower Columbia by Henry Zanka, von Heide, and Robert Toyd, which is a great short article source. So thank you for the opportunity, and I hope that leaves you with a little info. And
thank you very much for coming. You can probably tell I'm not used to using a microphone. In all the years I taught, frankly, the students never told me I needed one. Anyway, before a little closer. Oh boy. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Well, before I start talking about the Chinese expulsion that took place in the area around Mount Tabor, I need to give you some information to provide a context for why this was important and how Mount Tabor ended up fitting into the wild hysteria that was taking place in the western United States. So when you look at the settlement of Chinese America, about 95% of all of the Chinese that entered into the United States were settling into the West Coast, with Oregon having the second largest population, second to California. So by 1880, Chinese in Portland totaled over 1,600 residents. And if you compare that with what was happening in other locations in the Pacific Northwest, Seattle had 246, Tacoma had 155. So looking at that 1,600 residents was really a significant number. The Chinese may have been viewed as a distasteful people, but were considered for their economic value to the city and the state. The broad sentiment allowed the ethnic community to grow and support both a significant urban and rural Chinatown, which is the only such example that took place in the United States. The population grew from precious metal strikes, employment opportunities, and also the Burlingame Sewer Treaty between China and the United States that was signed in 1868. Now, the treaty afforded free immigration and travel for the Chinese within the United States in accordance with the most favored nation principle. So the Chinese were considered to be unskilled, they were cheap labor, they were willing labor, that ended up filling the gap needed for labor in rail line construction, maintenance, farming, cannery work, mining, brick making, and public works projects that included roadway, bridge, and culvert construction. The Transcontinental Railroad completed construction in 1869, and that ended up putting somewhere between 10 and 12,000 Chinese workers into an already flooded labor market. Large numbers of laborers and the onset of many years of national cyclical economic decline put the Chinese laborers at an unprecedented risk as scapegoats for depression woes. The most vocal opponents to their presence were labor unions, including the Knights of Crispin, which started out as a shoemakers union, and the Workingmen's Party, which was a labor-oriented political organization. Popular journals like the Illustrated Wasp, or just the Wasp, that started in San Francisco in 1877, and Puck magazine, which started in New York in 1876, those were the all-German editions. The all-English edition came out at the same time that the Wasp started its inaugural issue. So these were weekly satire magazines that frequently played on the idea that the Chinese were taking over and covertly monopolizing many of the areas of American industry. The Wasp was the most widely read magazine on the West Coast, and from the Wasp's inaugural issue, the Chinese were portrayed as being an infestation, criminal, ruthless, immoral, and subversive. So the violence against Chinese Americans, their homes, and their businesses proliferated, and in part because of these journals, with their anti-Chinese rhetoric, and the rallies that were led by spokespeople like Dennis Carty of the Workingmen's Party, Daniel Cronin, who represented the Knights of Crispin, and Burdett Haskell, who helped lead some of the riots that were taking place or that had taken place in San Francisco. Cities in the western United States were reading the words of Carney and his banner statement that began with "Down with the bloated monopolist" and ended up morphing over to "The Chinese must go." With the violence came a demand to Washington, D.C. that Congress needed to act to pass immigration legislation that would keep Chinese labor out of America. And the complaints revolved around the ideas that they worked too cheaply, that they took jobs away from white Americans, they sent money back to China and money wasn't being recirculated in the community, and that they were basically an infestation of the city. One suggestion even included the idea that perhaps we needed to build walls around our borders to keep the United States safe from immigration. Now, does any of that sound familiar to you at all? So Labor sold this idea to Congress by saying that the legislation had the power to stop the violence that they had already started to see happening in American cities. So in May of 1882, President Arthur signed the Chinese Exclusion Act into law. Now, this was the first significant immigration law that was passed in the United States. It was also the first to address eligibility based solely on race. It suspended the immigration of Chinese laborers for 10 years, a provision that actually ended up being extended for 61 years as the law kept being revised. The law suspended labor from coming into the country, but it didn't answer the Chinese question as how do you get rid of the Chinese who are already here. So the post-exclusion, after the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, it didn't stop the violence against Chinese laborers, and the ferocity worsened between 1885 and 1886, being two of the worst years in terms of riot, violence, and expulsion efforts. Estimates of violence and expulsion, they vary according to historian, but it's safe to say that at least 200 such incidences of violence and expulsion occurred in California, 19 in Washington State, and 11 in Oregon between 1850 and 1907. Of particular note was the one that occurred in Tacoma, where the vigilantes were so well organized and systematic in terrorizing and getting rid of the Chinese and burning Chinatown so that they couldn't return. It became known as the Tacoma Method, and it was one that they looked at as something that could be emulated in other towns on the West Coast. So getting back to Daniel Cronin with the Knights of Crispin was credited with successfully removing 200 Chinese from Tacoma, and the committee of 15 who were responsible for the Tacoma Method included their mayor, their council people, and their city judges. Ironically, in 1894, Tacoma businessmen voted to bring the Chinese back because of the new shipping line that was going to launch between Tacoma and China, but they didn't come back. Cronin also made his way to Seattle to help incite expulsion, and he made his way to Portland in January of 1886, where he promised the removal of all of Portland's Chinese in 3 months, just as he had accomplished in Tacoma. On the 9th of February, 1886, Burnett Haskell also arrived in Portland to help lead the anti-Chinese meetings. On the 11th of February, anti-Chinese Congress gave 40 days for all of the Chinese in Portland to leave the city. Expulsion was partially played out on the stage of dueling media that included the Oregonian reaffirming that law and order must prevail and that, quote, the Chinese will not be maltreated, looted, ejected from their houses, expelled from the city, or murdered, and that the decree of the anti-Chinese Congress was nothing more than vapor, end quote. On the other side, the anti-Chinese Congress called for a boycott of the Oregonian for its lack of support to labor. The Puck Journal, which is shown on the right here, showcased Oregon and the Chinese question on the cover of their magazine on the 24th of February, 1886. Their political cartoon personified Oregon as a Wild West character and on an undecided precipice that centered on the city of Portland, but also on the land east of the Willamette. The choice was either death to the Chinese if they stayed, or forcing their return to China. As that issue of Puck was released, 160 Chinese were expelled from the Oregon City woolen mills, but their leaving didn't reflect either of the Puck's choices, as the Willamette steamer they boarded took them to Portland and ultimately into Portland's Chinatown. . 'Cause 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 ' The Oregonian had already noted in previous issues that clearing the densely forested areas that blanketed Oregon and Washington territory was essential for the future of development, cultivation, and to allow higher forms of skilled white labor to take over and expand the potential of that area's economy. As part of the expulsion, anti-Chinese exclusionists turned their sights to the area east of the Willamette and the Chinese woodcutter and grubber. It became a version of the Tacoma method that was set into motion in the middle of the night on the 28th of February and into the early morning hours of the 1st of March, 1886. Now, I put this map together. Planners love maps. I put this map together to explain the drama of Chinese exclusion that was happening east of the Willamette. So on this first point 1A, and the photograph that accompanies it, at 1:30 in the morning on March 1st, 50 Chinese were driven out of their encampment that was located just below the Portland flouring mills at the north end of Albina by 30 masked men, half of whom were carrying revolvers. The photo of 1A shows a typical Chinese camp setting that was in the Dalles. So it's just to give you an idea of what they may have looked like. The first group of Chinese had been contracted to work for Joseph DeLay, who was a wood trader or a wood dealer by trade and living in Albina. It was reported that some of this land that they were clearing was for Judge Matthew Deedy, though this has yet to be substantiated. They were assembled with their possessions in order to leave on the Albina ferry. One of the mob awakened William Moreland, a resident and the night captain of the Albina ferry. Moreland refused to take anyone anywhere without the 5-cent per person payment for a passage fare, which was paid by one of the mob. In point 1B, within 30 minutes, a second trip of 50 Chinese from the outskirts of Albina and East Portland were similarly rounded up by armed rioters wearing masks or sacks over their heads. Like the first group, they were taken to the Albina ferry for another trip across the Willamette. And in point 1C, at 2:30, a third and final trip for the night rounded up another 80 Chinese, this time from an encampment located in an area 3 to 4 miles outside of what would have been the outskirts of undeveloped Albina and East Portland in the rural areas of the county. While the Oregonian called for calmness, the next day the local anti-Chinese factions, including the Knights of Labor, agreed to send members to the east side and into the farmlands once again to finish the removal of the Chinese. So in point 2, the Chinese expulsion of Mount Tabor was one that was equally ambitious and occurred on March 5th at 3:30 in the morning. The Chinese were scattered in the rural areas at and around Mount Tabor, with 27 Chinese being the largest single group to be rounded up. They had been contracted by Mount Tabor Postmaster Charles Fields. The red star and corresponding photograph show the building that was once occupied by S.H. Fields and Sons, Merchandise, Insurance, and Post Office in 1886 and at the time of the expulsion. According to a plat and facilities map from the Library of Congress, the post office was near or at what is now the southwest corner at the intersection of Southeast Stark and Southeast Scott Drive. We can be sure that the Chinese were not hired under Fields in his position as postmaster. Such hiring would have come directly out of the Central Post Office Bureau in Washington, D.C. It's more likely that Fields hired them through one of the Chinese labor contractors that were all located in Portland's old Chinatown. Of the 6 Chinese employment agencies or labor contractors that were listed, only Yang It advertised services in the Mount Tabor and Albina City Directory at that time. Near the green star on the map, the Fields had hired a crew of 27 Chinese to cut 800 cords of wood, half of which was completed at the time of expulsion. And I included a small diagram of what a cord of wood looks like. I mean, I may live in Seattle, but I had no idea until I took a look at this. Not only is it a tremendous amount of wood, but it also has to be something that is very carefully stacked. So the whole idea that you would hire 27 men to cut 800 cords is just absolutely phenomenal. It is very likely that Fields arranged for the hire of Chinese for land clearance of the approximately 38 acres of property that his family owned, about 1¼ mile from the current Mount Tabor Park eastern boundary that was owned by his family. Their property likely would have yielded slightly less than 600 cords of wood, according to current U.S. Forest Service estimates. Another indication that the hired clearance that Fields did was probably for people outside of his own family. The remaining Chinese were in the forested areas and scattered encampments along the railroad tracks in an area that's indicated within the red dash and dotted line. In total, 125 Chinese were driven out of Mount Tabor by 60 masked men, all of whom had revolvers. As before, the Mount Tabor Chinese were herded to the Albina Ferry, but by 15 of the mob members, not the entire group that had gone over to the area east of the Willamette. The number 15 bore strong association to the Tacoma method that was also enacted by that Committee of 15. Captain Moreland, attempted to communicate with the Chinese that their crossing was voluntary and told the mob again that crossing would not be done without payment. The mob leader paid $5 and everyone boarded. That morning, the Oregonian reported that all of the Chinese were badly frightened and far too scared to talk to the police, and that an interview of two people who were in the mob indicated what an incredibly good time they had. Like the Albina and East Portland expulsion, the Mount Tabor Chinese headed for greater safety and camaraderie in Portland's Chinatown. On the 12th of March, Daniel Cronin participated in what appears to be his last visit to Oregon and his last anti-Chinese rally. It was countered by Mayor Gates' call for a mass city meeting to organize public sentiment for law and order, reminding the Oregonian readers that such violence against the Chinese discredited the city and the state. By the 23rd of March, the East Portland Merchants and Laboring Men's Anti-Coolie League held a meeting, but only a few attended. The brief meeting concluded that the anti-Chinese movement was a failure, as they were now all occupying Portland. They also concluded at the end of the meeting that what they really wanted out of their effort was, quote, more money. The two-word phrase was the only one that got a response of the attendees as they all began to chant, more money. The Mount Tabor expulsion was the last of the large-scale episodes of Chinese removal, but violent acts still followed the Chinese community. Some examples included dynamiting a Chinese laundry in Portland's Chinatown on the 24th of March, and forced removal of Chinese workers who were employed along the Columbia Slough that included robbery and burning their shanties so that they could not return. They also headed for Portland. The Oregonian grew bolder, supporting the Chinese and defending themselves and their homes, however temporary they might be. Interestingly, none of the 7 laundry businesses in Albina and East Portland at the time were forced out in the East Side expulsion, and in subsequent years, they remained. The city of Portland's Chinese community almost tripled between 1880, when it was 1,612, and 1890, when the Chinese community count was in excess of 4,500. Exclusionists met their match in Portland. Expelling 125 Chinese from areas like Mount Tabor was one thing, but removal of 4,500 was far too formidable.
My name is Darrell Millner, and I want to start out by addressing something that Eliza told you in my introduction. She mentioned that I might be a Laker fan, and I speak at this forum from time to time, and Eliza is in the habit of introducing me, but she never tells me if she's going to tell that to the crowd. So I always insist on this table, the one closest to the door, just in case I have to make a run for it. But we've been having such a bad year this year that even Portland fans are kind of sympathetic. I'm here to talk about another black man in Oregon, a little earlier version. His name is York. You had on your seat when you came in a packet that looks like this. You might have been glancing through it, but I want to give you a little information to help you understand what each page represents. So if you pick up your packet, you'll see on the front page an event that took place about 2 years ago, and it's hard for me to believe that it's been 2 years now. But it took place at Mount Tabor Park, and what you see on the right-hand side of the page is a statue that mysteriously appeared in Mount Tabor on a pedestal that had been devoted to an earlier white citizen of Portland that had been previously torn down, of a man named York. Now, most people in Oregon and in Portland don't really recognize that name when I mention it, because when I do talks like this and I begin to suggest that Oregon has a black history, generally speaking, the audience says to itself, I didn't know we had any of that. And York is a perfect example of that, because you know parts of the York story already, you just don't know it was York. You know parts of the story because you've heard of Lewis and Clark. Lewis and Clark came to Oregon, and in particular, they came to the Portland area, at least Clark did, in the early 1800s. If you turn to the next page, or the back of the front page, you'll see kind of a diagram of the Lewis and Clark expedition. President Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark to Oregon. Really, he sent them to investigate a recent purchase that he had made called the Louisiana Territory, and to go all the way to the Pacific if they could manage it. And I think one of the things that is underappreciated about the Lewis and Clark story is, as you look at the map, they managed to find the most difficult way to get to Oregon possible. So I think they need to be appreciated for that reason, as well as many others. York was along on the expedition. Between 1804 and 1806, he came to Oregon with Lewis and Clark because he was the slave of William Clark. William Clark was a slave owner, as most of the prominent Americans of that generation were, including President Jefferson himself. When he came to Oregon, if you look at the facing page that says April 2, 1806, you'll see why his story is connected to Mount Tabor and why we might be interested in York's story if we live here in Portland. He was among the first Americans who came to what we now call the Portland area. And this particular entry in the journal of Lewis and Clark records the day that William Clark led a small party of the expedition up the Willamette River to the area that we know as the St. John's area, the Portland University of Portland area today. They were the first Americans to come here. York was the first black man to come to what we call Portland today. If you'll turn the page. The scholarship of the Lewis and Clark expedition leaves a lot to be desired if you really want to understand America in the early 1800s, especially the racial aspects of America in that generation. Not just in terms of Oregon, of course, but in terms of the whole American history of that generation. This page represents a typical example of the way that story has been told over time. The traditional narrative of American Western history includes the Lewis and Clark expedition. This particular version talks about when Lewis and Clark returned to the United States, because of course that's an important part of why that story is of so much interest to us. We wouldn't talk about it if they didn't get back. And when they got back, and historians tell that story, this is the version, this is the impression that they often give you. If you look at the paragraph in the middle of the page, you'll see a part that's underlined in red. And this is how that narrative often describes what the Lewis and Clark expedition amounted to. It says it was like going on a trip to the moon. Okay. Now, in fact, nothing could be more inaccurate than that. The Lewis and Clark expedition had nothing to do with going to the moon. The Lewis and Clark expedition traversed the continent, but it was a continent already full of people and already full of history. So if this is the version, this is the approach that you get to the Lewis and Clark story, you're never going to really understand the important details that are a part of that story. You look at the next page, please. We generally assume that Lewis and Clark were the first people to come to Oregon across the continent, the first people to travel across the North American continent. And that's not true. Lewis and Clark were pretty near the end of the list before we get to the interstate freeway system. This page represents the first people who crossed the North American continent who were not indigenous to the continent itself. If you look to the lower right-hand side, you'll see that the line, the solid line, starts in Cuba. This is history from the 1500s. The first non-natives to be an important factor in North America were the Spanish. The Spanish conquistadors, following Columbus, began to populate the Caribbean and eventually work their way to the North American continent. In 1528, an expedition of about 500 Spaniards came from Cuba north to conquer Florida. Okay? And this is the representation of the next 10 years of their experience. When they got to Florida, they were unsuccessful in their conquest plans. The native population was a little more resistant than they had imagined it would be, and they ran into a hurricane that occasionally runs through that area. The expedition was quickly reduced to about 4 men, and for the next 10 years, they wandered across the North American continent. That group of 4 included 1 black man. York was not the first black man to cross the continent. His name was Estebanico. And as you follow the solid line, you'll see it goes all the way across the southern North American continent and then eventually down to the center of Spanish activity in the area, Mexico City. When they got to Mexico City, after surviving that 10 years of sometimes enslavement, sometimes mindless wandering across the continent, they told fabulous tales of cities that were made of gold. And that encouraged and inspired the Spaniards to retrace some of their steps. That's the line with the dashes across it. That retracing was led by Estebanico, who became the leader of the Spanish expedition that comes up from Mexico through Arizona, New Mexico, places like Colorado and Wyoming, eventually down back through Texas and back to Mexico City. They never found the cities of gold, and Estebanico was actually killed in one of the encounters with the native village in southeastern Arizona. So, Lewis and Clark were not the first to cross the continent. This particular group crossed it pretty unintentionally, but also pretty early. In the 1500s, about 3 centuries before the American wagon trains began to roll across the continent in the most familiar part of Oregon history. No one comes to Oregon for more than 5 or 10 years without learning about, or 5 or 10 minutes without learning about the wagon trains. If you turn to the next page, even in Lewis and Clark's own generation, they were not the first to cross the continent. This man was. His name is Alexander Mackenzie. He crossed the continent not south of the Lewis and Clark route, but north. He was a part of the fur trading generation. In the late 1700s, early 1800s, he was a fur trader that crossed the continent from east to west and eventually came into the area that we know as British Columbia today. Parts of British Columbia and other parts of Canada are named after Alexander Mackenzie. And when Lewis and Clark came west, they probably had the book that he wrote about his earlier expedition. That took place about 10 years before Lewis and Clark made their journey across the continent. So, Lewis and Clark were not the first. York was not the first black man to cross the continent. And York had also, if you turn to the next page, looks like this, York was also not the first black man who probably came to what we know as Oregon today. Okay? And that probably happened as early as the 1500s as well. So York got here in the early 1800s, but almost 300 years earlier than that, a group of other black men came into what we know as the Oregon area today. They probably came here with a man named Francis Drake, better known as Sir Francis Drake, because he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth I for being the first Englishman to sail around the world. Now, it wasn't just a journey around the world. He wasn't exactly a tourist. He was more like a pirate. He was in the Western Hemisphere to steal things from the Spanish, who had been the predominant European presence in the Western Hemisphere before the English got involved in Western Hemisphere activity. In 1577, he came to the Western Hemisphere to steal Spanish gold and silver. The Spanish didn't think too highly of that enterprise, and they chased him back to England. And he went back to England in a way that no Englishman had ever done before. He sailed around the world. And as the Spanish sailed chasing Drake up the Pacific coastline of the continent, he probably chased him into Oregon, where Drake hit out from Oregon, very near to the place we know as Lincoln City today, for a number of months. In the summer of 1577, fixed his ships, and then he sailed back across the Pacific and around the rest of the world, and eventually home to England. Now, the racial context of that story is interesting as well. They not only took gold and silver from the Spanish that they encountered in the Western Hemisphere, sometimes they took people as well. The Spanish were conducting a slave enterprise in the Western Hemisphere. It was a slave empire. Sometimes when Drake encountered Spanish ships or raided Spanish towns, he took some of the slaves with him on his attempt to evade the Spanish who were chasing him. As they chased Drake up the Pacific coast in 1577, he had probably as many as 3 black men and 1 black woman with him when they arrived in Oregon. They would represent the first black people who came to the area we know as Oregon today. Interestingly enough, the woman was probably pregnant, perhaps by Drake himself. And it suggested that that is the reason why the black passengers didn't make it back to England. Drake left them off on an island in the South Pacific. Drake had a family already back in England. So the interesting stories of the people who came to Oregon and when, and under what circumstances, are a little more complicated than the usual narrative about Oregon history that you're going to hear. You turn to the next page. Now, we don't have solid documentation of the blacks who came to Oregon with Drake, because when he got back to England, the Queen wanted to keep what they learned on that expedition secret from the rest of Europe. Europe was trying to find what was called the Northwest Passage, a way to get from Europe to China that came across the continent by a waterway. It was going to be of tremendous commercial value to the Europeans of that time. And thinking that Drake might have found the western end of the Northwest Passage, the Queen confiscated all of his journals and all of his diaries and all of the records that they kept on that around the world expedition. They went into the English archives. They've never been seen again. So we don't have documentary proof of the blacks who came to Oregon with Drake. But what you're looking at is the first documented record of a black person who came to Oregon, and he came before York as well. He came in 1788 with another explorer, not pirate, but this time a businessman trying to take advantage of the fur trade with China. His name was Captain Robert Gray. And when he came to Oregon, he had an interracial crew as well. This is the story of an encounter that took place in Tillamook Bay in 1788. The native population, I suppose, a little worried about these increasing numbers of illegal immigrants, had a violent encounter with Gray's crew. One of his crew members was killed. His name is Marcus Lopius. This is the record of that particular encounter and that day on Tillamook Bay, where Marcus Lopius, a black man, a member of that group, was killed by the Native Americans. It's highlighted for you in the red brackets in the right-hand column. So, what do we now know about York? Well, we know that Lewis and Clark weren't the first to come to Oregon across the continent. We now know that York was not the first black man to come to what we know as the Oregon, the Portland area as well. If you'll turn to the next page, you can learn a little bit more about the biography of York, a little bit about his life as a slave of William Clark. York was a member of the Clark family slave retinue, born about the same time as William, grew up with him, was his designated manservant. And William Clark brought him west with him when they came with the Lewis and Clark expedition. So a few of the details about York, just in a short biography for your information. Now, the York story has historic interest as well, not necessarily just because of what York did with Lewis and Clark, but because of the way the story has been told over the more than 200 years since Lewis and Clark visited Oregon. York was a black man. In the early 1800s, most black people in the country were slaves. Slaves were not considered to be capable of the kind of heroic, demanding work that an expedition across the continent would require. As a consequence, when stories of York have been told over that 200-year period, they basically fall into two categories that are very different, but in its own way, are representative of the way we have told American history, especially American racial history over that 200 years. If you look at the page that starts, well, the date is October 1804, the most remarkable aspect of the Lewis and Clark expedition was that not they were first, but they kept better records than anybody else. There were a number of people on that expedition who on a daily basis recorded what the expedition did. And they wrote everything down, the plants that they saw, the animals that they encountered, and of course, because they weren't going to the moon, the people that they interacted with. And so it is the journals of the Lewis and Clark expedition that are really what distinguishes them from the continental crossers in our early American history. This is an example of the kind of information that was preserved for us in those journals. And this one in particular involved the story of York. This is going to help us eventually get to why York is a part of our Lewis and Clark interest today. This particular journal entry talks about an incident that took place when the expedition visited a Native American village as they came up the Missouri River on their way west. The York story, the categories that you'll usually find it told in, falls into these very different kind of versions of what York as an individual and his contributions were. The original version of York made York a typical minstrel show Sambo, who was along on the expedition primarily for entertainment and to serve Clark as his manservant. York as Sambo is the version that dominated most of the 200 years since Lewis and Clark came to Oregon down to our own generation. This is represented as you turn the page in a typical narrative, a typical version of the entry that you saw just before, representing how that is now going to be a part of the historic record in the hands of historians and novelists and other writers in that 200-year period. And you'll see that the version of York in the hands of the Sambo writers, does everyone know what a Sambo is? I think as I look around the room, many people here would recognize that phrase, but it's a phrase that is more commonly known from a little earlier generation of American life. Everyone knows today what the N-word is. The N-word is the most prominent way to insult a black person imaginable in American culture. But for most of American history, the S-word was in a pretty close second place. Sambo was a way to insult a person of color if you were so inclined. So the Sambo tradition of portraying York is represented in this entry from a very popular book by a very popular novelist from the 1930s. Now, I don't expect you to have time to read through the whole version today, but what you will see as you do is that it has very little connection to the actual events of that year and that visit to that Native American village. I've given you both the version in the original narrative, and also as you look to the side of the page, the ways in which it departed from the actual event itself. So, York, for most of American history, was portrayed in a version of the Sambo, because black people were not supposed to be capable of the kind of activities and the kind of requirements that would make that kind of expedition successful. The other way that the York tradition has been represented is shown on the next page. In terms of American racial history, there are two things to remember. One is how bad it was for a long time, and two, that we have been able to change it, and we have been able to make progress, and we have been able to establish a different way of looking at our racial history. Sometimes that has included some of the difficulties that the original version included as well. The second way that York has been portrayed is what you can call York as superhero. And perhaps some other people in the room from an earlier generation might recall some of the superhero treatment of York that came from our civil rights period in the middle of the 20th century. Under the superhero version, you would probably think that it should have been called the York and Lewis and Clark expedition, because York was obviously, in this version, the most important member of the expedition. And certainly that's almost as, it's almost as inaccurate and misleading as the Sambo version was. York was neither a Sambo or a superhero on the expedition. He was a slave of William Clark, and he made valuable contributions to the expedition, but he made those contributions from an enslaved position. This superhero example that I wanted to share with you today comes from another important event in the course of Oregon history. In the 1990s, Oregon celebrated the 100-year anniversary of the wagon train period. And you know the wagon train is typically the association we make with Oregon history. And the wagon train period is certainly worthy of the kind of recognition that we give it. But by the 1990s, American historians and writers and novelists and other people who were telling these stories of earlier generations had got the diversity question and the diversity impetus as a way and a part of the way they tell those stories. If you look at the highlighted parts of the right-hand column of the page, you will see what that meant in terms of how York's contributions were going to be told in this civil rights generation. One of the things that York is identified as being is a guide and leader on the expedition, and also an individual who could speak French and translate for the captain, William Clark and Meriwether Lewis, translate with other individuals who were in the West at that time. It was not like a journey to the moon. When they got to the Mandan village on the upper Missouri, there were people there from Canada, there were people there from Spain, there were fur traders, there were many people from many different cultural and intellectual and racial backgrounds in addition to the native population. And York is given credit for being one of the interpreters who knew one of the other languages that was present in the village at that point, and he interpreted for the Americans who didn't speak French. Now, a reasonable question. If William Clark, the slave master, never learned how to speak French over the course of his life, how in the world did York learn how to speak French? He grew up in Virginia and Kentucky, just like William Clark. And the obvious answer is, it's not very likely that York learned how to speak French. But if he's going to be the leader of the expedition in this superhero version, then that's a convenient way to kind of establish that heroic stature. So, The consequence is that when we look at the way that the York story has been told over 200 years, we have to be very careful and very suspicious. He was neither a dancing minstrel show Sambo or the superhero leader of the expedition. But one thing that we can be sure of, because we have that journal entry, well, two things. He came to Portland and he was William Clark's slave. You turn to the next page. We've not always acknowledged that in the history that was told about Lewis and Clark, York, and their expedition. This is a typical historic, scholarly treatment of the Lewis and Clark, York, and William Clark relationship from not the end of the 18th century or the end of the 19th century or even the end of the 20th century. This is a version that was on the step or on the, well, right before we went into the 21st century. This is from 1989. And as late as 1989, we have historians writing that York and Clark were friends on the expedition. Okay. This is an example. I give you some corrective material at the bottom of the page, just to make sure that you understand. A slave is not the friend of his master. William Clark and York were not friends. Clark was the master, and we see that in the treatment that York received both on the journey and on the return. Turn to the next page. We are the beneficiaries of the historical accident. When Lewis and Clark came back, Clark wrote letters to other members of his family. And we have access to those letters. They got stuck in a trunk in an attic and were discovered for almost 200 years. When they were discovered at the end of the 20th century, we found out what that relationship between York and Clark was like when they got back to the eastern part of the continent. These are some entries from those letters. From those letters we learned that at one point Clark kind of rented out York to a slave breaker to break his will, to punish him. Because when they got back, we found out that York had a wife who lived in a different part of Louisiana, well, the Louisiana territory, but Clark ended up living in St. Louis. York's wife lived in Louisville. He wouldn't let York go back to visit his wife. This didn't make for a very pleasant relationship between the two when they got back. They were at odds. It was a hostile relationship. So Clark rented it out to try and break his spirit. At another point, he actually put him in jail, which you could do to slaves if you were a slave master at that time as a form of punishment. And then finally, because neither one of those attempts had been successful, he simply beat him. He called it trouncing him. And all of those slave-master relationships are a part of the record that we have available to us today to understand the true nature of the Lewis and Clark relationship. So, what does that have to do with York? What does that have to do with Mount Tabor? If you go back to the opening page of the package, you will see the picture, the vision, the image of York that was erected mysteriously and without permission on the top of Mount Tabor 2 years ago. Eventually, York's statue was vandalized and toppled and destroyed. And that brings, I think, to our attention one of the aspects of the neglect and the misinformation that a superhero version of the York story can present in 2023, our generation. And in the last chapter of York's life, the statue's life, and at the location of Mount Tabor. If you turn to the last page of the package, you'll see an email that I received just a few months ago. The people who vandalized the York statue were caught. And when they were caught, they were prosecuted. And eventually this email ended up on my machine at Portland State. Because my name, for whatever reason, has been associated with York, because I've studied the man and his story here in Oregon. In this particular email, as you see, and you see the underlined parts of the red underlined parts of the message that is delivered to me, York is considered to be one of the people responsible for the transfer of control of the Pacific Northwest from the indigenous population now to the current residents. Now, if you think about that for a minute, that is a remarkable misunderstanding of the relationship that a slave would have on that expedition. But it has consequences. The people who destroyed the York statue were people who assumed that he was one of the leaders of the expedition and one of the people responsible for that transition of ownership. Now, we carry that legacy into our generation. York at Mount Tabor is a continuation of the York Lewis and Clark story. It's a continuation of my studies and interest in the York story as a historian. But it has consequences in the generation that we still live in because it affects the way that people think about places like Mount Tabor. People who put statues up on Mount Tabor about, whether they're original Caucasian explorers and residents of the area, or slaves like York. And it can be confusing and misleading if we don't have the context to understand those stories within. Thank you very much.
Excuse me. Hello. Thank you, Darrell, and Dr. Marie Wong, and David Harrelson, and Pat Pritchard. My name is Neil Mattson. I'm the Executive Director of Bonneville Jazz, and thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Meg, Executive Director of PJCE, holding down the table back there. I want to introduce to you, we're going to have a little Q&A session here. I want to introduce to you a very important person in this project, tell you a little bit about the project, and then answer your questions. Also, we have a special introduction as well of a few people who are very integral to this project. So the gentleman standing to my left is Douglas Dietrich. He was the, well actually, at the time that we conceived of this project, about a year ago, he was Executive Director of Portland Jazz Composers Ensemble. And we wanted to celebrate the 10th anniversary, or the 10th festival, the Montevilla Jazz Festival's 10th festival, by doing a concert with the Portland Jazz Composers Ensemble that would include music that celebrated something really important to our community in around the neighborhood. And that subject became Mount Tabor Park. And we'll tell you just a little bit about what this process is and how you're a part of it by being here today. But Doug and I kind of conceived of this idea of having a community-inspired a community input process that would help composers write music for the Portland Jazz Composers Ensemble and perform it at Mount Tabor Park. And so I think that's a pretty good framework. But what's happening here today is, as Dr. Millner said, context. So we thought if we find composers that will create some beautiful music inspired by this place, we want some context, and we want to hear maybe some less untold stories to provide a greater context than maybe the dominant narrative, or maybe something that you might just think it's just a park in the city. So hopefully today you got a little bit more context. Maybe you took away something that was new to you. Obviously we'll have the opportunity to all investigate more on our own, and we have this amazing resource here today right now if you have any questions. But I want to give Doug an opportunity to share a little bit about his role in this project and introduce three very important people.
Hello, everybody. Thanks, Neil. Like Neil said, I'm Douglas Dietrich, and I've been thinking of myself as a little bit like Nancy Pelosi lately. So I was Executive Director of Portland Jazz Composers Ensemble for a long time. We did several projects in partnership with OHS, and so I'm really thankful. So a big thanks to Oregon Historical Society and to Eliza. Thank you so much. Okay, so one thing I was thinking, hearing all this incredible information, is that doing history is really hard work. There's so much, I mean, you know, I don't even know, just all of the time and attention and stamina that it takes over years to not only to learn all these things, but then to be able to transmit them in a way to an audience like that. That's a lot of work. But you all have done a lot of work too by sitting in those chairs for quite a while. And I want to invite you to stand up and take a stretch break if you want. And as we do that, I'm going to just introduce our composers. I know you've been sitting there for a little while, so I just want to give you a chance to move around a little bit if you want. All right. So, oh, maybe I should have done this in a different order, but that's okay. So composers, I want to introduce you to our three composers. So standing right next to me, this is Kirsten Bollman. Raise your hand, Cyrus. This is Cyrus Nabiport. And all the way to the right is James Powers. So we're going to do a quick, well, maybe not so quick. I mean, I think you can if you need to go, you can feel free to. But we're going to do a question and answer session, and we're going to give our composers the first shot to ask a question to our panelists. You guys can sit now. Good job. So these composers bring some really interesting variety of backgrounds to the project. They applied along with, there was 24 other applicants. We had a total of 27 who all applied to do the project, and they were the ones that rose to the top because they kind of offered, just in the tiny confines of this application that we put out into the community, they rose to the top because they kind of gave an inkling of a really vibrant vision of what they might be able to do with this project and of their connection to the place and the effort that they wanted to put into it. And so it was a panel of 5 community members that selected them, and we're really happy to have them all together here today. So before we go on, let's see, I think that's all the housekeeping we do. So Eliza also has a microphone. So composers, I want to invite you, any of you, to ask the first question if you have it. There we go.
I'm Cyrus. I grew up in the Hollywood Rose City area. I'm someone who has a lot of personal connection with Mount Tabor, just in personal life experience there, but for most of my life know very little about the history of the place, in this sort of detail. You talked about early on a sense of awe being part of the value that Mount Tabor brings. I was wondering if any of y'all have any recommendations on reading material more in the, say, poetry or prose realm in regards to Mount Tabor, or really any of the Portland area landscape, specifically relating to this sense of awe or reverence that we experience in looking at these types of places and experiencing them.
I'll do one. It's not as specific to Portland, but I think that Indigenous poetry in Oregon, reading one of Elizabeth Woody's books, who's been the poet laureate of Oregon and is a Warm Springs tribal member, who spent a lot of time living here in Portland. And so there's just the ability for that. I don't know personally if there's a specific poem that comes to mind, but she writes really beautifully in connecting kind of Indigenous worldview with like the environment and places. And I think that perspective could probably be really cycle. She has a number of them, so Elizabeth. She's also the director of the museum at Warm Springs.
Was an Oregon Poet Laureate as well.
Also on an ecological sort of kick, I'm curious, since Mount Tabor, I'm not sure exactly what year it was established as a park, but I know that a lot of the landscape around here was old growth forest, like sequoias and redwoods and things, and with all the timber industry, there are more deciduous trees around now because of that whole history, and I'm just curious if there are parts of Mount Tabor Park that still have these older ecosystems, or, you know.
Yeah, very important. One of the things that you may remember seeing when I pointed out what Mount Tabor looked like in the late 1800s, there were still trees on top. And as we heard from Chinese activities, they were harvesting wood substantially. And yet, when we look at the age of the Doug fir trees, to be specific, they are anywhere from 150 to 200 years old on average. So these trees have been here far longer than we have in a way. And so they almost constitutes an old growth forest in that respect. The other idea is that our oldest tree apparently is around 500 years old. So the Doug firs represent a major part of that. The other trees that are pretty typical of Mount Tabor, the bay leaf maple tree and the red cedars, tend not to have quite as long a life, particularly the maple trees, but they regrow pretty quickly in that respect. So I don't know if that quite answers your question.
I want to add a little bit onto that. I caution overemphasis of old growth on that mountain, and I think that that's more of a recent creation. And to echo, some of that, like population die-off here started as early as 1500 when those expeditions were coming and we had trade down the line. And so there's been some really great research, Willamette Valley specific, that's talked about fire intervals and human fire on the landscape. And that fire on places like that mountaintop would intentionally keep it a lot more open. And so you would have trees, but it would likely be sort of like sentinel, really large trees, few of them, not like the amount of tree cover that we have today in that environment prior to kind of the changing of less and less fire on the landscape that would have happened around 1500 forward. And the view sheds being so important from that location that indigenous fire practices would have maintained that and also would have favored species like oak on that mountaintop.
I guess I'm curious about the impetus behind the actual creation of the park as a park, and who maybe possessed the land that is now Mount Tabor Park directly before that.
So the question was, what was the impetus behind actually forming it as a park in the city of Portland?
Yeah, I think the primary, am I working? I think the primary point that you're referring to is the Olmsted brothers, who were basically landscape people that are largely responsible for Central Park in New York City. They had an office out here, and they had really designed a number of places in Portland, particularly Ladd's Addition. And one of the things they specifically said was that little hill right there, you should protect that as a park. And then one of their employees, a guy named Emmanuel Mishi, eventually, who worked for the Olmsted brothers, eventually became the first person to start organizing Mount Tabor into a park. That was around 1913 in that area. Mishi went on to deal with many parks in Portland and add his to it. And he added a lot of trees that were given to him as gifts, particularly from China. And they were planted at Mount Tabor and other cities.
Any more questions for the composers? So we wanted to open it up to any of you that have any questions for the panelists, and even if you want to put the composers on the spot, maybe with a musical question, that would be great too. Eliza's coming to you.
Hi, my name is Lois Levine. Thank you so much for this fantastic panel and the thoughtfulness of who you brought in to speak. This has been great. I live basically at Belmont and Cesar Chavez Street, and our neighborhood association actually in their newsletter in November ran a history of the neighborhood that started with so-and-so who arrived in 1850, was one of the first settlers on Mount Tabor. And it was so settler colonialist a history, and I'm really sorry that I could not bring everybody from our neighborhood association here to be better oriented with the presenters today. But given that we have composers in the audience, and this is going to be, I'm also a historian, not of this place, but sometimes trying to put ourselves in different past moments in a place, trying to understand what the soundscape was like is a really powerful thing to do. So the historians on the panel are maybe not necessarily used to doing that, but I wonder, because you have all been so thoughtful in thinking about the experiences of the people you were speaking of across millennia, really, what might we think of as the soundscape of Mount Tabor? Because that might be really interesting for the composers to think about.
Mount Tabor is not just something I study for the people or the history. I go to Mount Tabor twice every week. I walk the stairs there, and I do it because it's different than being in Portland. And the primary reason it's different is it's quiet. And you can hear things that are not, in quotes, human things. You can hear the wind in the trees, and you can hear the birds, and you can hear all those things that are a part of a different time and maybe a different place. But that's a very important part of what Mount Tabor is to me. And, so I guess that's all I have to say about it. I'll get quiet myself. Oh, yeah. This is a story I've told to Eliza when the York statue was up there. When you walk to the top, the York statue is on the far southern end of the top. And, it had a powerful impact on me, because one of the things that would happen as I would walk around the top, people would be standing, talking to their kids, talking to their spouse, talking to people they might have brought just for the reason of seeing the York statue on the top of Mount Tabor. It was interesting to listen to their conversations. Most of the conversations didn't really have much historical information, historical knowledge, but the statue had an impact on them, and you could hear it in their conversations. So the silence and the conversations you hear other people sharing with the people who mean something to them have been an important part of my experience at the top of Mount Tabor.
I want to share about the landscape and that Mount Tabor, and it was talked about the Portland Basin being this relatively flat place, and we've really changed what it looks like from what it did to my ancestors. And what that place looked like was as far back on the east side, 14th Street, that's where the river was, right? We have all these rivers and waterways under the east side that have been piped and put underground. And a part of understanding what that is that is river complexity. And those are marshlands that are half mile to a mile wide marshlands along the Willamette. And when you're on Columbia Slough, you have that whole area. Today, if you ever go to Kelly Point Park, you see two rivers coming together. But if you talk to river scientists, they'll tell you that actually the Willamette River mostly flows down Multnomah Channel, because that's where the water flows. works. And it was the case for a long time before that. Our word in the Clackamas language for that place is called the dammed up place, right? Lewis and Clark missed the whole mouth of the river when they went down the river. They didn't even know that the Willamette River came in until they were coming back up the river. So imagine sitting on top of Mount Tabor, and the part that comes to mind from sound is birds, right? Wapato is like a favored food of canvasback ducks, and with the decline of Wapato, we've had the decline of canvasback ducks, who also happen to be the tastiest of all ducks, if there's any other duck hunters out there. But birds, the sound of birds, right? Imagine the most massive bird migration over your area and like hearing those sounds and being on a rise in the middle of tons of wetlands, right? Like vastly larger than what we have today. And that's a sound that I think that you would hear loud and clear.
I think just one comment I might make, being a part of the visitor center at Mount Tabor, and a couple of my colleagues that are volunteers are here in the audience. There's an interesting aspect to the York sculpture at Mount Tabor, and that was the way it attracted people to the park. And I think we were really surprised and really enjoyed this superhero image of York. But people came from literally all across the U.S. I mean, we have probably every state in the union represented by visitors at the park, and many of them came specifically to go to see that York sculpture. So it makes it an interesting conflict in a way between the history and the value of an image as a superhero.
If I could, and I'm not sure that this will address exactly what you're talking about, but Eliza had mentioned that this other project that I'm working on is a history of the Luckney Music Club in Seattle. And as part of that, I've been going through translations of the origins of the music club, because I'm your typical American-born Chinese. I don't read and I don't speak. And so I've been working with a translator. I meet with her once a week. And as I was working on this project and thinking about the sheer bulk of wood choppers, I mean, we're talking about better than 200 Chinese are all in the same area cutting wood. And it's funny that when you think about the sound of chopping wood, it's very much like Chinese drums in the opera club. And there's also, as part of this translation, I'm finding a lot of connection between what was happening in Seattle, and they were relying on the opera club that was here in Portland for writing of the significance of that Chinese music. But if you listen to the opera club performances, and that's been part of this research I've been doing, that every Sunday afternoon I'm either at the library or at the music club. But the sound that you hear is very much like that regular beat that you could imagine of so many people chopping wood, so many Chinese.
So I think we have time for one more question. Anybody who's got it? All right? Yeah.
David, you had mentioned the connection of high places like Mount Tabor and other mountains to native cultures, and that being a place to like see the landscape. It got me thinking that there are some really high places around here, like Mount Hood and the Three Sisters. Is there anything resembling mountain climbing culture in native cultures, like some kind of sense of conquest to get to the highest place? And I'm just curious, anything like that.
I grew up the son of a mountaineer who used to teach courses at the Mountaineers up in the Seattle area, so I can kind of speak a little bit to that. I've also worked in the woods a lot in my life as a wildland firefighter and a pre-commercial timber person. No. I can pretty definitively say that. But what is really interesting is how it's changed. And how it's changed is, tribal people on all of our reservations were a huge part of the timber industry. My own grandfather owned a timber company here in Western Oregon and put a lot of tribal people to work through it. But what the Hyatt places were for is where you went in the summertime. It was in that seasonal round that I talked about. And there's a lot of areas, in fact, near some of our ski areas today are really well-known gathering areas for berries and for other things. And hundreds of people would come together, many times even from different cultural groups in those gathering places, berry camps. I chuckle today because they're oftentimes in wilderness areas where you have to have a permit for 12 people. And I have very good historical records that point to 200, 1,000 tribal people gathering and somehow not having huge impact, but still being able to gather berries there. So it's for those purposes. There's a lot of creation stories about those landforms. There's a great Malala story that's been published widely, like in the book Coyote Was Going There, about grizzly and coyote having a feat of strength on the slopes of Mount Hood. They are important places, and a big part of life was where people would go into those places for spirit power. And they would often do that, staying up there for 5 days at a time and depriving themselves of not sleeping and not eating. And, magically they'd see visions when you don't sleep or eat and you're in the summer and it's hot. And they would come back and it would be a part of defining those people's lives. And so those are some of the activities that took place in Hyatt places.
Thank you all so much. So we're going to conclude the program today, and I want to thank our panelists. Thank you all so very much. And our composers. And to all the project partners, Montevilla Jazz, Portland Jazz Composers Ensemble, Friends of Mount Tabor Park, and Oregon Historical Society. And there are many people who have contributed to this already. It's been a community effort, and you're all part of that. I wanted to give and you can join, okay. There's you can join back there our email list. Meg is waving her pencil or her pen around in the air, so do that. We would love to be in touch with you. And actually, if you RSVP for this event with your email address, we've got you. We've captured you. So we'll be in touch with you. But we'll tell you more about our composers, about their process. There's another event coming up on March 18th, and it is going to be at Tabor Space. And we're inviting all comers to come and share your favorite Mount Tabor story. So come and tell us about the time a squirrel stole your lunch, or whatever. Whatever it is. Composers will be there and hearing and sharing their own stories, and then there's going to be also a guided tour of the park. Two of them actually, because there's the first one filled up. There's so many people that are interested, so we're really excited about that and honored to see that response from the community. I wanted to share one final thought. This is the beginning of the creative process for these composers. And September 1st will be the concert at the Caldera Amphitheater on the park. And so from this point to then, there's a lot of mystery that happens. There's a lot of mysterious things that happen in the creative process. And then eventually they get to the end. And so this act of you all participating in that is really an unusual thing, and it's kind of an exciting thing for me to see as just somebody who loves the arts and loves to see these processes happen. And I have one more thought to share with you, and this kind of brings us back to jazz history. Raise your hand if you know John Coltrane. If you've heard of John Coltrane, right? Yeah, I think. Good. You should have. But John Coltrane is one of our most famous jazz musicians. And he, in addition to all the amazing music he made, he kind of became a spiritual figure. There's actually a Church of John Coltrane. And so very much a very important figure to so many people. When he passed away, there was a small private family funeral, but then there was a much larger celebration of his life at St. Peter's Church in Manhattan. And I don't know who organized it, but one thing I do know about it was that it was kind of an amazing event just on its own, that all these people were so touched by John Coltrane's legacy and his work that they all got together and shared this. And so, for instance, if you know the musician Albert Ayler, there's going to be fewer hands that go up with Albert Ayler. Yeah, of course, Daniel. But Albert Ayler is somebody very important to me, but John Coltrane was so important to him that he went and played, and there was a recording of that music made, and it's wild and passionate, and it's amazing. But I learned about this in a documentary, a history documentary. Years later, I was living in New York. I had moved there, and it turned out a friend of mine who was a bass player, and he was the son of somebody I had studied with, and so we got together, and he's like, oh yeah, I have a job at a church. And I was like, oh, that's cool. And then I met him at the church, and it was this church, it was St. Peter's Church, where John Coltrane's funeral was. And so, like, for me, kind of stepping into this room where I knew this thing could happen, and there are many other important connections to many of the jazz, like the pantheon of jazz heroes in New York, I just was like, wow, I'm in this kind of a hallowed space, a sacred space. To me as a jazz musician, because it's all, it has its own sacred, value to many people as well. But I just want to say that as you guys embark on this process, you're doing that for all of these people, the people that come to the concert, the people that tell you their favorite squirrel theft story at Mount Tabor, but making a place and kind of fixing it in our heart, fixing it in our imagination and our memory. It's an honor to do it, and I'm excited for you guys to do it. And thanks to the panel for their help, and to all of you. So that was something I wanted to share with you that I was really excited about to share. And now I've done it, so good job. So the very last thing is from Neil Matson.
No, actually, you covered it all, so good job. I was going to say September 1st is a Friday evening, will be the concert. March 18th, you said, will be the community input, so we want you all to come to that. You can RSVP, and then April 15th and April 16th, the tour of the park. So you said all that, so I was useless to be here, but thank you, everybody. Thank you, Eliza, and Oregon Historical Society, and please sign up on our email list in the back. Thanks. And thank you, panel.